Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar for Health Systems Global. Today we're going to talk about social accountability in health systems, how this can be strengthened through participation and cooperative learning, thinking about the roles of citizen voice in health systems to improve healthcare and health outcomes. Our session brings together academics and practitioners from all over the world, with speakers from Guatemala, Norway, Scotland and South Africa, who we'll introduce in a moment. But first, I'd like to introduce our chairperson. Maria van der Merwe has 20 years experience working in the public sector and was formerly a senior official in the Mpumalanga Provincial Department of Health in South Africa, where she drove significant positive change in maternal and child well-being, spearheading evidence-based and whole systems approaches. Maria is a co-investigator on the verbal autopsy with Participatory Action Research Programme in South Africa, President-elect of the Association for Dietetics in South Africa, Honorary Senior Researcher within the School of Public Health at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and is an associate of the Aberdeen Centre for Health Data Science at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Bringing a unique perspective, both as a researcher and as a governmental decision maker, Maria will help us think through how we can give citizen voice teeth to have bite. What we mean by that is how we can connect in mutually beneficial and in mutually empowering and sustainable ways the processes of raising community voice with the processes of enabling state response for regular and systematic participation in health. Maria, our chair, over to you.
Thank you, Lucia, and thank you for the opportunity. Globally, community participation in the planning and implementation of healthcare has been promoted for decades, including back to 1946 in the WHO Constitution, formulating the right to health, as well as more than 4 decades ago the Alma Ata Declaration on Primary Healthcare. More recently, in 2030, the Agenda for Sustainable Development recognizes that health goes beyond survival. It also includes human rights, equity, empowerment of vulnerable populations, and it urges policy formulation and health service organization to be developed and implemented in partnership with service users within an enabling health system environment. Just this week, the World Health Organization launched a handbook on social participation for universal health coverage titled Voice, Agency, Empowerment. This webinar is therefore timely and aimed at building an understanding of approaches to strategically advance social accountability in health systems. Our first presenter is Dr. Ana Lorena Ruano. Having worked as a researcher in public health since 2003, Dr. Ruano is the managing editor for the International Journal for Equity in Health and associate professor at the Center for International Health at the University of Bergen in Norway. She's the coordinator for the Research and Learning Unit at the Center for the Study of Equity and Governance in Health Systems, the CEGSS in Guatemala, with a special interest in the role of social participation and municipal level health systems. Ana Lorena will be presenting on social accountability as an umbrella term encompassing citizen-led actions to hold governments and politicians to account. Thank you, and over to Dr. Ruano.
Thank you very much, Maria. Let me share my screen. There. And presentation. Like Maria mentioned, my name is Ana Lorena Ruano, and I am the managing editor for the International Journal for Equity and Health, but also an associate professor at the Center for International Health at the University of Bergen in Norway, and the research and learning coordinator at the Center for the Study of Equity and Governance in Health Systems, CEGSS, in Guatemala. Today, I'm going to talk about how citizen-led actions can be helpful for holding governments and politicians to account. But before, I would like to talk a little bit about what is social accountability, since this is the main topic of our webinar today. Social accountability is the ongoing collective effort to hold public officials to account for providing the public goods the state is responsible for. It includes participation in public policy and underscores the links between the different types of citizen action. It aims to institutionalize durable societal control over policies and uses political and reputational costs to push power holders to respond. And this is based on agreed set of standards, information about public actions that are being undertaken, justification for these actions, and imposition of sanctions or rewards as appropriate. Social accountability also has some core features that are very important for us to understand to really grasp the way that is being used on the ground today. Social accountability is a means of restraining power. It presumes the delegation of power because we as citizens have elected officials and they are implementing the policies on our behalf. Because stakeholders are acting on behalf of groups, the power is delegated. But since we have delegated, we can also take it away. Social accountability also presumes opacity because all decisions taken will not be transparent. And it looks to call power holders to explain their actions subject to public reason. So why social accountability? Because governments and states in low and middle income countries have expanded and have grown into large and opaque organizations that have great discretion in decision making. This growth of public bureaucracy has not been accompanied by a similar growth in democratic control. Oh, there, sorry. The Center for Equity and Governance in Health Systems uses this model to work on social accountability. I will describe the model briefly, and later my colleague Fernando Jose Jerez will present the actual experience of working with community leaders on social accountability. So we have a 2-4-6 stage process. The first stage is evidence gathering, and this is foundational to everything that we do around social accountability. Evidence for us is not understood as the pyramid of evidence where RCTs are the most important. In fact, our experience demonstrates or shows that our academic understanding of what evidence is not very impactful when it comes to policy and decision makers. Evidence then is understood as information that is gathered collectively by communities of users. In our case, these communities of users are called the Community Defenders for the Right to Health, and they collect as much detail as possible and then file reports through our online SMS platform or using other multimedia methods. Then CEGSS follows up with the type of support and liaising that is needed so that they can act strategically and impact at the appropriate level using the correct means. Afterwards, we move to preparing the space for engagement with authorities. So now that we have gathered the evidence, we need to present it to public officials so we can ask for a resolution of this problem. We have realized over the course of about 15 years that we've been working on this, that invited spaces are not as effective in problem solving as claimed spaces. So the ones where the Community Defenders for the Right to Health have taken on and demanded to be accepted in, those are the ones where we have seen the most beneficial progress. Once we're preparing to engage with authorities, we need to help communities who are not always very highly educated or have access to formal education. And so we use different means like decision trees to help them identify the next steps and help them be clear on the strategy and the process that we're going to undertake. We identify the next steps, and then we move towards presenting this evidence and our demands to the authorities. Authorities then, we have found, react in 3 different ways. They can acknowledge the problem and plan to solve it. They can show politeness, but no intent to solve the problem. They can deny the existence of the problem and completely refuse engagement, or they can be openly hostile and threaten community members. With support from CEGSS, depending on the answer from the authorities, we revise the strategy and prepare for the next steps. This is called adjusting the strategy. The strategy will depend on the problem. For example, illegal charges and corruption are more serious than routine stockouts at facilities. We identify the appropriate governance level for engagement, And we use human rights or legal bodies to help us mediate problems if authorities refuse to solve them. Specific protocols are in place in case of serious threats. So the organizations that are supporting communities in doing this must be aware and must be prepared for serious threats and how to handle them and how to protect community members. Afterwards, we move on to follow-up actions. These include municipal level activities that inform the community about the solution to the problem or for civic mobilization to push for the solution of the problem. It also includes traveling to the regional seat or even to the capital of the country to engage with higher level officials who may be better able to solve the problem because that is the appropriate governance level that should be engaged. We also work with the Ombudsman Office, especially in this level, at this step. And finally, we verify resolutions and plan for a new cycle. When the community defenders from the right to health inform that a problem has been solved, then we need to document the same way that we documented evidence of the problem, we need to document that it has been solved. And this verification is then sent to our online platform and linked to the whole file so that defenders can come back and find the entire information together. Thank you. That was a very brief, but I hope that we can now move forward to more grounded experiences. Maria, you're muted.
Thank you, Ana Lorena. Thank you very much for the presentation, highlighting the need for social accountability and also reminding us that it's an ongoing process towards holding public officials and state accountable for the goods and services that they are responsible for, and also for sharing the specific model applied by the Center for the Study of Equity and Governance in Health Systems in Guatemala. Our next presentation will focus on participation, which is a political process recognizing and enabling those at the heart of the issue to address it. Our presenter is Dr. Lucia D'Ambrosio. Dr. D'Ambrosio is a social scientist from Scotland, a senior lecturer and associate director at the Aberdeen Centre for Health Data Science, as well as deputy director of the Centre for Global Development at the University of Aberdeen, where she leads a program advancing health policy and system research, applying verbal autopsy to understand causes and circumstances of death in populations, and advancing cooperative learning with rural communities and district health systems. She also works in the health system in Scotland with preventative measures for COVID-19 in populations experiencing intersectional hardship. Thank you very much, and over to Dr. D'Ambrosio.
Thank you, Maria. Let me try and share the screen. Okay, so I will talk about participation, as Maria says, as a political process that recognizes and enables those at the sharp end, those at the heart of the issue, to address it. This is a definition of social participation from Lowenson from this year. That states social participation in health refers to people's individual and collective power and involvement in the conditions, decisions, and actions that affect their health and health services. So this is the idea that people's experiential knowledge can help develop more acceptable, more effective ways to protect and promote their health and address the health risks that they face. At its core, participation is about equity and justice. It's about the raising of people's voices, especially from the margins, empowering those with limited agency to raise their voice and claim their rights for health and, by extension, healthcare. It's about recognizing mutual interdependencies, shared vulnerabilities as part of a social justice approach. And it's assumed to contribute to a process of democratization, the devolution of power here over health, public goods of health services, to people, to communities. It's an idea with widespread support from the landmark Declaration of Primary Healthcare, Health for All from 1978, from WHO, participation was seen as a central enabling mechanism, the full involvement of people in systems and services. To Monday this week, when the WHO, as Maria highlighted, released a major new text on social participation for universal health coverage. Support also exists at many other levels, subnational, national, as well as international. This is a clip from my country, Scotland, where we've recently introduced participatory budgeting, for example. The message is there's widespread support for participation, and this is important and this is encouraging. However, in practice, it means that there are many operational interpretations of the concept. As this quote from the WHO sets out, this is my emphasis, participation can mean informing people, consulting, or empowering communities. These are different things. So there are many interpretations of participation. How do we make sense of these? I think the differences are central to the question of whether participatory approaches imply a shift towards governance through local partnerships with communities, in which power and the balance of power and responsibility is open and openly negotiated, or processes that can manipulate communities into accepting additional responsibilities, something of like an abdication of the state from its responsibility to the people, the population. There's a stark difference here. As this quote by Rolf sets out in terms of the latter, again, my emphasis, participation policies can become regressive, imposing greater risks and responsibilities upon more disadvantaged communities in return for lower levels of power. Considering that connecting with decision-making, the authorities often involves connecting with the structures that tend to reproduce existing power hierarchies. When we think about the concept of participation, and particularly participation connecting with decision-making, we need clear and critical focus on these tensions. There are tools to help us with this. This is a classic ladder of citizen participation from Sherry Arnstein from 1969 that set out a continuum of interpretations from at the bottom, utilitarian forms of participation where it's a means to an end, offsetting the costs of services, versus towards the top, empowerment approaches, supporting those with little or no power to exercise greater collective control over decisions and actions that contribute to social transformation and political change. Here, participation is an end in itself. And these fuller interpretations can also build a key appreciation that, to quote Jenny Pope, collective action alone cannot deliver, again, my emphasis, the redistribution of power and resources required for sustainable reductions in social and health inequalities. This will only happen if disadvantaged communities build alliances, locally, nationally, internationally, with the authorities, with social movements. So these conceptual debates can help us appreciate that greater collective control over decisions and actions that contribute to social and political change is ultimately about these alliances, about connecting with and influencing decision-making. And this is where we can connect to Johnathan Fox and ideas about social accountability, the idea of systematic participation in the routine processes for our purposes of service organization and delivery, the idea of connecting citizen voice with state response in an ongoing way. So what does this mean in practice? Well, actually, it's recognized to be a gap in the literature, the how-to of participation, much of which focuses, again, to use a term from Pope, the inward gaze, improving health behaviors or local conditions or methods and tools for participation. It's not that these are without importance. The inward gaze is necessary for the development of key capabilities in communities to raise voice, but we also need the outward gaze. And this means a focus on the social, structural, the systems transformation, This is the idea that it's not only communities that need to change. And this means raising community voice while simultaneously navigating the system's opportunities and challenges. And this is a serious undertaking, especially for those with limited agency and power. So perhaps it's not surprising that this connection to decision-making is contentious. It's not always part of or even a priority in participatory processes. And indeed, who decides these endpoints? Ultimately, it's up to the stakeholders involved. Nevertheless, the outward gaze has to be strengthened if these approaches are to realize their potential. And this element is often described as the most fraught issue of participation. And again, this is where ideas of social accountability, raising voice, and state response in continual and mutually empowering ways can help us develop more detailed attention to what the opportunities are, what long-term commitment means, how to manage diverse views, and develop mutual empowerment, how to be legitimate, credible, and authentic, and how those relationships can be built in context of austerity. The case studies will provide more on the practical applications of these concepts, taking abstract ideas into the real world. And I probably don't have time to get into this in detail. So in summary, for participation to work, we need to blend the inward and the outward gaze in terms of representation, managing power asymmetries within and between key community constituencies, and the authorities, extending the collective power of communities, and in terms of spaces and processes. Similarly, being aware of forms of power that are more and less visible, limiting the opportunities for communities to develop and exercise collective control. In the South African case study, we'll hear about a participatory action research process. This is a method rooted in a paradigm that locates the nature and production of knowledge as an outcome of social relations. And as such, it's well suited to help us understand and progress participation in the context of health systems and health policy. These methods help us appreciate that health systems as social institutions are built out of existing social structures. And as such, they can reflect existing social inequalities, but they can also confront them. And from this foundation, PAR processes can address questions that are important to communities that focus on social problems, can strengthen communication, mutual respect with those in the health system, can provide frameworks that evolve with regular exchange and feedback, strengthening and institutionalizing trust and mutual understanding, bridging knowledge and practice by embedding problem solving and action to access evidence and evidence production, and ultimately strengthening the social accountability of the health system. To end, I think the pandemic brings with it important opportunities to reorient the community relationship with the state and to enable those fuller ideas of participation, inclusive of systems, social and political transformation. But again, there's tensions here, as the two quotes are intended to illustrate. On the one hand, many responses to the pandemic have been top-down, biomedical, technocratic, and even militarized. On the other, the uncertainty has opened opportunities for new ways of thinking, new multi-sectoral approaches, working with and independent of the state. So it's an important time to be sharing learning on participation, policy dialogue, and accountability processes to raise community voice, improve care and outcomes, and move towards reorientation of the state-society relationship, strategically advancing social accountability in the system and recognizing our mutual interdependencies and shared vulnerabilities as part of a social justice approach. Thank you, Maria. Back to you. So I think we may have lost Maria. Fernando, I think we are moving over to your presentation now. So let me introduce our next speaker, Fernando, hopefully while Maria reconnects. Fernando Jerez is coordinator for the Political Strategy Unit at the Center for the Study of Equity and Governance in Health Systems, CEGSS in Guatemala. Fernando is a political scientist with a degree from the Rafael Landivar University in Guatemala. He's worked for over 10 years conducting action research related to inequities in education and health systems, and has worked with grassroots organizations to boost accountability mechanisms in health services of the public sector and improve the right to health. Welcome, Fernando, over to you.
Good morning, thank you very much. I'm gonna share my presentation. Here it is. So I'm going to deep a little bit in what Lorena has already shared in her presentation. I'm going to go a little bit more detail about what we do in CEGSS and what is kind of the citizen engagement that we try to promote in the Red Salud grassroots organization. So give me a moment here. Okay, so I'm going to start talking a little bit about what is Red Salud and how it's organizing and how it's working in rural Guatemala to improve accountability in health. I'm going to speak a little bit about the role that CEGSS plays in that process. Then speak a little bit about the challenges around advocacy for the right to health in rural Mayan Guatemalan communities. How in this experience we are trying to build an adaptive approach. This adaptive approach has to do with promoting learning and resilience in a highly changing context, and some lessons that can be extracted from this experience. So Red Salud is it's a network of community leaders and community and users of public health services from 38 municipalities in Guatemala. These are not municipalities that are close. So they are spread in 5 departments and across 6 linguistic community. So in us, in CEGSS, it's always a challenge how to coordinate and try to adapt to all this diversity in Red Salud and the linguistic difficulties to try to grasp in the experience and try to push mechanisms to their both have fit in advocacy actions. Then they advocate for the improvement of health services, especially for the fulfillment of their right to health. They promote human rights in their communities. They monitor health service performance, in which they document conditions, document the stack of medicines, the how patients are being treated. Then they support patients and accompany them in presenting complaints in the cases in which there have been some mistreatment or there is a denial for the health staff to provide the services. And they document the conditions of health services. This documentation is being made in audio and video. They all the community leaders have a smartphone in which they try to document the condition. They go and try to record the testimonies and try to build evidence to engage authorities. So what do we do in CEGSS? By CEGSS, we provide technical assistance. We try to, based in the problems they have identified, try to work with them to find advocacy route, how we can engage authorities based on the challenges and the problems we have identified. We provide knowledge about legal frameworks and how to engage authorities based on the responsibilities they have defined by law. We support expenses of communications and transportation. Moving and traveling from indigenous communities in Guatemala is highly expensive, especially in the context of exclusion and poverty in which these communities live. We support organizations and promote learning in the experience. Red Salud now has more or less 10 years in which we have been learning with them how to organize, how to engage, how to document which evidence works better. And it has been a long process. And we accompany defenders in advocacy activities. Okay. What kind of the challenges faced? So Guatemala is a highly fragmented health system. Right now, the Ministry of Health has 91 semi-autonomous administrative entities into the Ministry of Health. So one authority has no jurisdiction, for example, in one village, for example, to the hospital is different, to the health post. So for communities, sometimes it's quite challenging. They identify a problem and they don't know in this kind of administrative maze which are the real responsible person that have to do with this issue. So that's kind of always a challenge. Who is the responsible? How to engage them, and how to make them accountable from these issues. This is more a cultural and a structural characteristic of Guatemala. There are very poor practices of accountability among health staff and among every kind of public staff. No, you know, they feel like they are doctors, they are medics, they have a degree, they are from the capital city, and what is going to tell a person with no knowledge about medicine how to do their work. So there are always these hierarchical issues in which they don't feel they feel entitled, and it's very difficult to make make them feel responsible. There is a highly discriminatory context and structural racism towards indigenous communities, and this has to do with the use of language of their own language, how they are dressed, and again some people from the capital city who as a professional doesn't see any value in what indigenous peasant is going to tell him. There are high levels of poverty among community and their leaders. There is a lack of information and lack of empowerment to engage authorities. They always feel like, this structural racism sometimes is introduced into our own conscience, and feel like, oh, I cannot say anything to the MD, I cannot say anything to the doctor. So we have to build this empowerment to make them feel entitled about their rights to claim better health services. There are normalized assumptions of how to get attention by public authorities. Again, it's very normalized. The mistreatment is very normalized. There are weak community organization because of the difference in language and the territorial spread of Red Salud. Sometimes it's poor communication between the defenders and in this administrative maze that I was referring, is a highly changing environment. So, for example, we start an advocacy process with one authority. In the think of 3, 4, or 6 months, there are changes, and we always kind of starting again, always given the first step. It's kind of difficult because always changing the administrative staff. So it's kind of challenging. So what we have to try to do is try to build an adaptive approach. And this has to do with different issues. One, this highly changing context that I was referring, and then the COVID situation that changed everything. And changed everything in a level of organization and in the level of traditional way of doing things in Mayan rural communities of Guatemala. So it's very common to organize in rural communities the assemblies of people in which they can talk, share, and it's very, very person to person. So with COVID, this changed everything. Now we have to move from this kind of personal kind of engagement to using Zoom meetings and trying to use technology to uh, have a dynamic kind of work. But it's difficult because sometimes people from communities are not quite used to using technology, so it's kind of a little bit difficult. We work in the organizational structure of Red Salud and trying to make a structure of representatives that can make decisions from their linguistic community. So, for example, we work, like I was telling, like in 6 community linguistic communities. So we have 3 representatives for each one who make decisions and try to communicate to their other leaders of that linguistic community about decision making in issues and problems and advocacy actions. These are being made by weekly debriefing sessions to grasp changes, challenges, and opportunities in the local settings. So we discuss which problems have you identified, which are the authorities, how can we help, how can we raise more awareness about this issue and work with them, making decisions. So this has helped us to close a little bit the gap of communication and strengthening the coordinations among defenders to help them have more power in the advocacy actions. There is also participatory discussion of legal framework to identify advocacy opportunities or ways to improve accountability of health authorities. There is a tendency always in engaging with authorities because nobody is responsible of anything. And everybody has put all their best effort and they put all their heart in what they do. But it's difficult because you go to authority and it's always the guilt is in someplace else. So we base on law and say, and based on law, we take that what law said, who is responsible. So CEGSS facilitates information about defenders, facilitates information, but defenders choose what fit better for their context and challenges. So we kind of provide ideas and provide kind of action route, but they are in the end who chooses what works better for them. We facilitate alliance building at the local level with Ombudsman Office staff, so they endorse the role of the defenders in their communities and try to push back a little bit this historical structure of racism and discrimination toward indigenous leaders. And then learn that advocacy means more than just reaching high-ranked official. It means building momentum and engaging in context building. This has to be very important, because in this highly changing environment, sometimes we want to go with the with the Minister of Health, which is highly inaccessible. But we have find out that working environment is more is sometimes is better than just go for high ranked, because we gain more awareness about the issue, we gain more recognition in the community. So when we talk to an authority, we have more power. So in promoting learning and resilience, we facilitate the exchange of experience among defenders in these different contexts. What are people doing, what are defenders doing in this village, what are they doing in this village, and try to make exchanges of this experience, and try to make everybody learn about what is being done in different contexts. In the early forms of organization, we do yearly planning. We sit in an assembly and plan for a year or 6 months. And this, for one side, it gives the community defenders some strength, because they feel, okay, we have a plan. Our plan is perfect, it's long term. We are going all these activities, but then something happened that make difficult the fulfillment of that plan. Sometimes it could be funding wise kind of issue that are not allowed to do all this activity. So we move from this yearly planning to small, scalable, and stackable and achievable goals. So instead of again this yearly plan, we're going to try to engage in these two issues and try to engage in the causes of these issues, and not just in the effects. So again, annual plans get us stuck to a strategy that cannot be adapted, because you have to fulfill the plan. You want to make the kind of the plan feel good, you know. You do a plan, you do all the activities, but you cannot adapt to this changing context. So in this yearly plan, we constantly insist in actions that don't work, but we have to do it because it's in the plan. They are planned in, for example, January, but now in April we have a different and different concept. But we insist in that action that we already define. And this changing political context make us learn that this yearly planning is not working. And leaving a planning included lessens the motivation. They feel like all this planning and all this work, it doesn't go anywhere. So again, this yearly planning, we go to more achievable kind of goals. And these small and scalable goals make them feel that they are achieving something. They now, from all this work, can see how the attention in public health services are changing, how are more stock of medicines. So they feel more that their action really are making a change. So for finalizing, just want to share some lessons of this experience. From this experience, linear models don't work for highly changing environments. You need to be more quick and adapt and be more like in a strategic setting, trying to feel the context, feel the changes, feel the opportunities, and listens. In highly exclusionary and hierarchical system, it helps engage in building context instead of looking at the roots to begin to engage with highly ranked officials. So again, for example, lack of funding in public health services is quite complex issue. You have to go to Congress, you have to go to the Ministry of Finance, you have to go to the Ministry of Health, so you have to engage with high-ranked officials in different institutions. Very difficult, very difficult. So instead of that, instead of going with the obvious that says, okay, you have a problem, go to authorities, we say, okay, we need to start to build up awareness in the community about this issue. Start talking with neighbors, making some activities in which people get more awareness about how much money the local officials have for health, and how they use this money. Things like that, to try to make awareness, build up a context which is favorable for our complaint, and then when we do this context work, engage authorities. And this take us to the next lesson is, don't follow manuals. Sometimes manuals are kind of very straightforward, very linear, and again, make you insist in sometimes and some things that doesn't work all the time. You need to adapt. And instead of following manuals, listen to people that are already in the system trying to make a change. Again, sometimes when you read a manual, everything works perfect. They presuppose that public health staff is in their best interest to listen, to talk to people, and to have an agreement to work together. Doesn't work like that. So instead, go to officials that are trying to make a change, that are resistant in the health system. Work with them, listen to them, and try to closing gaps in leaders, in patients, and staff that are trying to make change and work together. Sorry. Be patient. That's another important one. Be willing to go back to your steps, to look for lessons, and with the clarity that all works, because some actions are effectively giving you some results, but the action that not giving you results are giving you lessons. So everything works. Go back, try to identify lessons about what you're doing, and try to always keep adapting. Another lesson is building momentum. Building momentum is highly relevant because it keeps leaders motivated. It make them feel that all the effort that they put, it's really working to make a change. And in this COVID context, we try to implement the use of technology. This is because we want to make them feel engaged in something, not just, okay, we're now in this COVID situation. There are no meetings, so everybody in their home, and everything drops. So to avoid that, we use technology to have some level of engagement until everything is clear, to start accountability process. But use technology and try to have some level of engagement, and try to build a pace. We have an issue, engage for this issue, next step, and then do that, and then next step. It doesn't work, go back and evaluate, but always have to try to do something to make people feel engaged, to make people feel that all this effort that they put as a community leaders is working for something. Thank you very much. This has been my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to Fernando. With no single best model or mechanism for social accountability, it has indeed been very valuable for us to learn from your network activities. And to me, it particularly highlighted the value of an iterative and adaptive process, where you can use new knowledge and experience as a foundation for further learning. Thank you, Fernando. While Dr. D'Ambrosa pointed out that we don't have a how-to of participation that is clear-cut, we also have the opportunity to now learn from our second case study from Mpumalanga province in South Africa. And I would like to introduce our next presenter, Ms. Denny Mabeta. Denny is coordinator for the VAPAR program, a health policy and system research learning platform, supporting and assisting the public, policymakers, analysts, researchers, evaluators, and planners to engage and to learn by generating local data of practical relevance. As coordinator, Denny serves as a link between the MRC WIT's agent called Health and Demographic Surveillance System, the Department of Health in Mpumalanga province of South Africa, and other program stakeholders, particularly also including community representatives. Thank you and welcome. Over to you, Denny.
Thank you, Maria, for the introduction, and good day to the team and everyone. Allow me to share my screen before I start. So I'll be taking you through how we continue to build cooperative learning through the Mpumalanga Health Policy and System Research Learning Platform, the work that is done under the verbal autopsy with participatory action research in South Africa. Like I said, the work is done in South Africa, which is the upper middle income country with an estimated population of 59.6 million, third of which is rural. South Africa has a complex burden of communicable and non-communicable mortality, injuries, and violence, which are twice the global average. Hence, the new post-apartheid governance has embarked on a process to transform the health sector to a one community-based primary health care. This is done through the National Health Insurance, which was started in 2012, aiming to achieve the universal health coverage. Implementation of the NHI has come with a lot of challenges, such as underinvestment, human resource crisis, corruption, and deteriorating of infrastructure. And it has brought a lot of tension between bringing service closer to people and restricted operational places to understand and report to local public health priorities. The current work is done under the agent called Health and Social Demographic Surveillance System, which is under the rural Mpumalanga province of South Africa. This unit was established in 1992 as a way of supporting the district health system with routine health data. Above is the map showing where Mpumalanga is, and this is a picture just showing as a situation of how the rural agent code looks like. Based on the fact that the Department of the District Health System has limited data to set priorities on public health settings, we have started the VAPAR program in 2017, aiming to address exclusion from health system by connecting service users and providers to generate and to act on research evidence, and also to embed a system of knowledge production and exchange via partnership approach. So we are trying to build relationship between the service providers and the people within the communities. The process builds a collective dialogue and action through iterative reflection, action learning cycle by a series of work that involve building the community voice, connecting to decision-making structures, and embedding in community health systems. So I'll be explaining how we conducted this series of work and what we have learned from each. According to Lowenson, participatory action research recognizes the wealth of asset that community members bring to the process of knowing, creating knowledge, and acting on that knowledge, and to bring the change. In theory, that's how PAR is explained, but I will be explaining further how we use the participatory action approach to give the community voice a teeth. So our process involves identifying key issues of community concern, identifying key players, capture life experiences, and to generate action addressing the identified problems. We used various tools to conduct the PR process. And there are quite a lot of tools, but I'll just give an example of some of the tools that we use. On top, there's the problem tree that we use to explore on the problem, and then the photo voice to capture life experiences of the communities with regard to the identified topic. However, it's important to acknowledge that these tools are very important in a PAR process. But again, we have to acknowledge the important component that PAR has in addressing health issues in the community. First being the process has abilities or has a potential to create safer spaces for engagement between community stakeholders and the service providers. And it also plays a huge role in building strong and sustainable relationships and partners between the two. I will take you through the first learning of the three that I described on my previous slide, which is building community capacity and voice. We achieve this by sharing power through research, giving the community voice a tooth through this process. Where we reconvened with participants from our previous work, we established the relationship with community participants during our pilot work. And then we brought them on board where they nominated priority health topic of local concern. And then we shared the routine mortality data on burden of community nominated priorities, data that was relevant in their topic. Like I said now, this process involves involvement of the communities using their community voice to impact policy, and they were also involved equally in running the process. They took it upon themselves to nominate voices of the socially excluded participants. As researchers, we introduced and reinforced participatory PAR principles, such as no delegation principles of collective validation. We also managed expectations. We were consistent with the process, and always remember that the process is not about making promises to the communities, and that was maintained throughout. We also respected people's voice and their time in involving themselves in the process. The process also encouraged equal partnership in research process, where stakeholders, community stakeholders now realize that they are not subject on the study, but they're equal partners in producing community evidence and combining the statistical data from the VETS agent code HSG. I will be sharing with you what we learned from building the community voice. As I said that now this was a community-led process. We see now there's a shift as the picture describes there. Initially, the process was led by researchers, but now we see a more active role from the community participation, where they now share the evidence among themselves throughout the process. They also reported how the process have made an impact in their life, highlighting that they see an increase in confidence and skills in public speaking, because now they know that they are active agents of change. They also described how the process allowed them to build partnerships, linking people with common issues at local level. And they highlighted how these regular interactions among the communities build mutual understanding, trust, and dialogue between otherwise disconnected groups. Also, an important issue was that it has brought facilitation and stimulation of different thinking about these different groups of people who have this common issues at hand. We as researchers have also reflected on the process to learn, and we have learned few things from the reflections. The first being that initially when we made contact with the community stakeholders, there was a lot of blame towards service providers, blaming the service providers for poor service, for inadequate health services within the communities. And now as the process continues, which we have seen a shift, now community stakeholders acknowledge how they contribute towards the problem and are willing and committing to work with the service providers to bring change. You'll imagine that this socially excluded voice, they are people who are faced with the problem in hand. They are frustrated and they are damaged by what they experience on daily basis. And we had come across such people during our engagement, where people now use these spaces to express themselves, to vent out their frustrations. And that came as disruptive, and some were intimidating other community stakeholders. So we used from our learning a gentle approach to manage these disruptions, to make sure that the process goes smooth. Okay, moving to the learning 2 of 3, where we were forming new alliances with the district health systems. We engage with Department of Health and other government stakeholders. We involve the local and the sub-district non-government organizations to analyze, interpret, and act on the community evidence that was collected during the work we did with the communities. We collectively implemented the local action plans with Department of Health and other key stakeholders, where we also reflected and adapted the process. The reflection process provided a basis within the routine health system process and linked to district health policy and planning priorities. As a result, we formalized connections with the district health system to work with community health workers, local clinic operation managers, and clinic committee members to build mutual understanding, respect, and trust together. In 2020, you remember that's when the pandemic started. We had to adapt our process to best fit in the context of the pandemic. So we engaged with communities and Department of Health stakeholders on how we can make contributions towards the health systems. From the engagement, we have gathered few learnings as reported by the government, Department of Health and other government stakeholders, and from our own perspective. The Department of Health stakeholders reported that they see this format as relevant and acceptable and worthwhile, and that there is a need to create more spaces such as VAPAR in community so that we can continue to build mutual understanding, relationships, and trust between communities and authorities. Both communities and Department of Health see this VAPAR process as supportive process in rural primary health care to raise community voice in service planning and delivery. So I would like to share some of the code that made during our engagement with both the community stakeholders and the government stakeholders. So during the reflection process with the Department of Health, one mentioned that the workshops confirmed that community participation is key to planning and improving service delivery. The other stakeholders, the community stakeholders, said there has been a lot of service delivery protests in communities, but they did not accomplish much. Everyone realized that it is time to shift our ways to thinking and initiate dialogue to unite and collaborate and create sustainable partnership to solve community problems. These codes support the evidence that this approach using the PAR method has a potential to collectively address social issues and health issues faced by the communities. As researchers, we learned that institutionalizing moves towards mutual beneficial process of combining the claimed and invited spaces. The community, we have done this work. However, our focus now towards the community health workers that we did in 2020 show that community health workers form a bridge between communities and service providers. However, with so much work that they are doing, they still need to be supported and be recognized by the public health systems. We also learned that regular connection and exchange builds common purpose connected to key policy priorities. I will be sharing with you the learning 3 of 3, which involve developing collective capabilities. The current work co-produced the mandate by contributing to building community health workers' capabilities in rapid evidence generating in terms of burden and determinants of the disease, the human experience of that burden, and on feasible local actions. Now, as you can see, that is myself there with a team of community health workers and community mentors during one of the focus of the workshops that we're conducting. We've realized that now the work helps the community health workers to understand their role and their contribution in the community better than they used to do before. And the mandate also support the utilization of this evidence in public health sector planning and management process in the district health setting, in routine primary health care, planning and review. And it further developed multi-sectoral engagement and collective action supporting community responses in addressing social determinants. So this allows the service providers, local service providers, such as our clinic operational managers and clinic committee members, to support the community health workers in doing their work effectively. So like I said, this is the process. We are still learning, and currently we are towards the end of our learning cycle, and we have made, we've discovered few learnings. From the current work, the early findings suggest that there are still many challenges faced by the community health workers. As much as they are committed to promote health and link their communities to the health care regardless of resource limitation and other barriers, such as lack of permanent contract and transportation. Sometimes they even lack the basic utensils such as gloves, which help them to effectively conduct their work at the communities. Our findings also show that community health workers' capabilities to connect with and understand priorities of local communities have improved. Now they see how they are so valuable to the communities by showing how they engage, the approach they use in engaging with their superiors or their supervisors at the clinics and the authorities at the community level. They have also showed how they are so confident and how they feel like the community has started to recognize their role, which makes them motivate them more to do their work within the communities. We also learned a few things from our own perspective. We learned that regular interactions between communities, community health workers, and the communities build a shared purpose and community policy relevance. There's still challenges remaining in community in connecting to the higher levels of systems such as the district and the upper provincial levels. And as researchers, we are seen as neutral arbiters between communities and authorities. This is because the VETS Agincourt HSG has built a long-term relationship with the communities, and they have the potential to link communities and authorities in that manner. Now, this means that embedding this work, this process within the VETS Agincourt HSG has a potential to build sustainable relationships between communities and the district health systems. Like I started with a quote from Lowenstein, I'll also conclude my slides with one. I've highlighted that this is a learning process and it requires a lot of work and a lot of patience and time. Lowenstein says that community engagement requires time, empathy, communication, resources, measures that take into account social cultural diversity, that build confidence that community evidence is being heard and being used to. I believe that a continuous building up of relationships between community stakeholders and service providers have in the long run a huge potential or impact in solving the health and social issues that our communities face daily, and also build the community voice as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Denny. And for the case study, again, demonstrating that an adaptive process allows for learning. And in this case, in addition to process learning, also providing valuable insight into how the community voice is built, followed by further strengthening of this voice and starting to get teeth when alliances are formed of health system actors and starting to move from us and them towards a we. With the ultimate goal then of embedding into routine health system processes, and particularly in this context, not only through design of the program, but rather particularly through means that have been collectively identified by the various stakeholders. Thank you very much. Introducing our final presenter before we move into our panel discussion, I'm very privileged to introduce Professor Sophie Witter, Chair in International Health Financing and Health Systems at the Institute of Global Health and Development at Queen Margaret University, Edinburgh, Scotland. Professor Witter is a health economist specializing in health financing policy and health systems research. She works on a number of programs focused on health systems in low and middle income settings, and recently undertook a review of learning health systems in low and middle income countries. She has extensive experience of health financing and human resource research and leading complex evaluations, as well as providing technical advisory services to ministries of health and development partners. Thank you very much, Professor Witter, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Maria. So Yes, I am going to be building on the work that you've just mentioned, which was done for the Alliance for Health Policy and Systems Research, looking at learning health systems and linking it to this concept of social accountability. So as the previous speakers have recognized, health systems themselves are complex, are themselves subject to social relations, to power dynamics, and often the actors within them have all sorts of constraints. So the way that they're enabled to engage with communities, but also to reflect internally, process and learn is really critical. So 18 months ago, we were asked to, I'm struggling to advance my slides now, this is great. All right, let me just stop sharing and see if I restart, if that helps. Otherwise, if it doesn't work, Maria, I'll ask you if you can do these slides for me. Let me see. No, that's really interesting. Okay, it's not letting me move forward. Maria, do you have my slides to share?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
I do.
All right, do you want to try and see if that works better? Apologies, I'm not sure why it's doing that. Okay, that's great, thanks. If we can just go to the start. So yeah, 18 months ago, just the next slide, please. We were asked to work on a background paper for a flagship report by the Alliance on Learning Health Systems. And we had a look at the literature in this area. And essentially, most of it was driven from high-income country settings and was very focused on sort of operational level, provider level, and particularly on data use. And actually relatively few studies that came from low middle income country settings. And this was one of the few, the framework you can see here, which was developed by Aknif and his colleagues in Morocco. And at the center of it is the same learning cycle as we've been discussing really through all of the presentations, which has three broad phases. So starting with acquisition of information, and then a central node, which is around processing of that information, and then the actions that flow from that. And of course, it then moves back into the beginning of the process. And so the framework they developed is a very simple one, which looks at the kind of leadership functions that are needed to support learning within a health system, but also the environmental factors which need to be in place and the kind of learning processes. Next slide, please. So we tried to adapt from that, and we were very interested in looking at the different levels. Obviously, the health system itself has multiple levels. We've been talking about community health workers already in this session. In some ways, they sort of sit at the bottom of the process, but all of those levels need to have learning processes embedded, and they also need to be connected. We also recognize, of course, that there's many different types of learning. So we do need to have technical and kind of data-driven learning functions, but also political and experiential. And we were very interested in learning which is driven from within. So not so much push models of policy transfer, for example, but more how people and organizations and teams within the system are able to reflect and capitalize on their experiences. We want to look at the different blocks of the system, so how you get interactions, for example, between health information systems and drug supply, but also recognizing that the formal system itself is in a constant interaction with informal providers and informal health systems. And of course, between systems and communities. And that's where a lot of these critical interactions happen, and learning can happen or indeed be blocked. So learning is about effective adaptation to needs and context. And it's not just about the kind of high-level policy decisions, but very much around daily practice and implementation. And for practical purposes, what we were most interested in, because obviously learning per se is a good thing, nobody's going to argue with that, was about what are the characteristics of systems that seem to be better at learning and how can we enable them. Next slide, please. So just to jump to the chase a little bit and just to pick a few of the findings from the background report that we did in 2019. First of all, we reflected on the fact that there's rather limited explicit literature from the low middle income country settings, but actually there is a very rich body of lived experience. And we've already been hearing some of that on the panel today from South Africa and also from Guatemala. But in the report, we also interviewed key informants. we looked at the importance, as I said, of experiential learning and the need to create these spaces. And the kind of VAPAR model is a very nice example that Denny's just been describing about that, trying to put spaces which connect community staff and managers to address challenges and find solutions, and recognizing that does imply a power shift, and some systems are readier to do that than others. I think the story from Guatemala was a really nice example of how you can push when there's resistance and perhaps the space is not quite there yet. We also thought that it's very important to acknowledge that the health systems themselves are knowledge producers, but that it's not an automatic function. It does need to be valued, it needs to be promoted, and it needs to be resourced. And that's not always the case in all systems. And that some countries have got some very nice examples of institutions and processes that support effective learning that we can all benefit from. And there are many local level examples, which, however, are sometimes challenging to scale up. Just to pick up some of the common constraints which are identified to learning health systems, one is around short time horizons. Some of these have been touched on by other speakers, resource constraints. Sometimes learning itself is not seen as a priority, so it also has to be advocated. And you find fragmented accountability, a little like Fernanda's example, where it's always somebody else's fault, it's never my fault. So also sometimes limited research capacity, problems of inertia, political interests, risk aversion, data shortages, and staff turnover. These are some of the most common examples that came up in the case studies. So there is a real, I think this is something that's come up, the international agenda is really being promoted now heavily and is a key aspect for health system strengthening, but also itself needs some more research and more empirical study, trying to understand which processes can be more effective and what lessons we can learn. Next slide, please. So just to highlight the model is about to come out in the forthcoming flagship report from the Alliance. The interesting thing is how many resonances there are with the previous presentations in this panel. So in terms of the learning functions, there's a really strong emphasis not just on data and evidence and kind of formal evidence as we might normally understand it in the research community, but also very much this experiential learning and the importance of dialogue and creating consensus and understanding and indeed participation. But there's also a strong recognition of the fact that systems need to be in place to build capacity and deploy capacity and institutionalize these processes and support those learning functions. And that needs learning strategies and supportive systems and resourcing from the national level. Next slide, please. Just to touch lightly on these, because I think we're running a little bit behind time, but there's a strong recognition within the report that of the function of deliberation, which I think again has come out of a number of the speakers' presentations, how important that is to kind of contextualize learning, to codify knowledge, to surface knowledge, and that building platforms to support these deliberative processes is really key to successful policy development and implementation. Next slide, thank you. So just to pick a couple of examples of these sorts of platforms, obviously the one we've just been discussing around VAPAR is one example. There's also in the report some very positive examples from Brazil, and the use of local health councils, which have been used to deliberate on policy at different levels and also negotiate on budgets. But also quite a well-documented example from Thailand, where National Health Assembly has been given statutory basis and brings together different groups to develop and negotiate public health policy resolutions. And this very much talks to this triangle that moves mountain concept, and you see the figure on the right, the importance of connecting the kind of knowledge sector, the government sector, and the people sector, as it's named here, which is very much what Denny was talking about in the VAPAR platform. Next slide. So obviously to do that, community citizens and users of health service require health literacy, and that can be broken down in different ways, but certainly implies a kind of functional literacy. So what you might see it as a more basic level, but also very importantly, interactive health literacy. So social and cognitive skills to be able to extract and apply information. And again, I think we've seen some very nice grounded example of those in the conversation today. And then, of course, also critical health literacy. And we've been working on that a lot in VAPAR, trying to look at how you analyze information and how you use that to create control for community participants. Next slide. So what that implies is capacity strengthening is not just about imparting public information on health services, rights and protections, as Fernando, for example, illustrated, but also developing those social skills to be able to engage meaningfully with one another and with those key stakeholders, but also empowering people with critical and transformative abilities so they can actually engage effectively in what could otherwise be quite tokenistic consultative fora. Next slide. Again, not to go through a lot of evidence on this, but just to say there is a body of evidence that shows the value of creating these kind of structures and engagements. And just to give 3 examples here, one focused on engaging individual users in the context of health promotion programs. There's also documentation from India looking at leadership training for sub-district committee members and the impacts that can be generated from that. And also an example looking at development of disaster resilience amongst communities. Next slide. So obviously this implies action that is not just within the health sector. The health system and sector have their responsibilities, but also all the other stakeholders, again, as illustrated in the examples today, play a very important role in creating these platforms, strengthening them, supporting the kind of skills, confidence, social abilities that enable their effective use, and providing education and support in health rights entitlements and indeed understanding of governance and laws. Next slide. I think that's where I'm going to wrap up. Thank you very much. And back to Maria for discussion.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for sharing the recent updates as well as the key findings of your review on learning health systems. And again, to me, highlighting that deliberative engagement with stakeholders is required in order to build consensus and enable collective actions. We will move into a panel discussion of a number of questions to our panelists, reflecting on the concepts that have been introduced in the presentations as well as the 2 case studies on how social accountability in health systems can be strengthened through participation and cooperative learning to not only raise community voice but ultimately elicit a state response. My first question will be directed at Fernando. Low accountability can potentially be addressed through the creation of an enabling environment. And such an enabling environment relies on several aspects, including establishing and building relationships and trust. At the same time, the process of social accountability is as much a political as a technical process, as you have also highlighted in your case study. Reflecting on the concepts and the 2 case studies, how can the process of enabling citizens to exercise their voice and ultimately impacting on policy and planning processes be approached strategically in your view, Fernando?
Thank you. It's a quite challenging. I think let me see. I think people and civil society need to start to speak to each other more, to be able. I mean, sometimes thinking advocacy are very vertical, from people to public staff. And sometimes it's very weak conditions to advocacy, very weak conditions to being here and to be really be taken into account. Some of the risks, the risks you see very commonly, especially in context of Latin America, but I'm sure is a common practice, and all the experiences that these workshop bring together is the issue that government tends to implement participatory mechanisms just to validate or just to put a little bit of democratic tokenistic practices of participation. It's very common. So I think people need to start to speak more to each other, wide a little bit horizontally, to gain force and try to reverse that condition. I think that is one of the main challenges. Try to change a little bit the scope in which we understand advocacy. Again, wide horizontally, and build conditions to change these vertical situation forward, talking to engaging government.
Thank you very much, Fernando. And I think that also resonates well with the sharing from Denny and the VAPAR team, where community participants specifically said that participating in this process helped them with feelings of empowerment, of confidence, of enabling them to speak up, to represent themselves, to represent their community. So the more you do that, the more you feel that you are empowered and able to speak up. Thank you very much. While geographically diverse, the two settings in our case studies, it's very notable that entrenched social and structural inequalities are cross-cutting in the two contexts, together with supportive policy contexts for citizen participation. So policies are stating that engagement and citizen participation is required, yet it's not always the practice. In reality, there are very few spaces for meaningful policy dialogue and accountability processes within a rural district health system. Ana Lorena, with a focus on strategically advancing social accountability, what would you regard as key lessons with regards to recognizing the need for system transformation and advocating for recognition of the most marginalized individuals and groups within systems that are characterized by these deeply embedded social inequalities?
That is not an easy question to answer. I don't know if I can take the next 3 years. But I think it's difficult to work with really marginalized populations. It is our experience at CEGSS that when you reach these marginalized populations, you have to build so much skill. You have to build so much capacity. You have to have so much patience. And I think like Lucia was saying, and I also research participation quite extensively, you need time. Nothing is as good as having sustained support over a long period of time to reap benefits. And I know that that doesn't work with the funding cycles or the way research works right now, but the reality is that our defenders are able to impact the system in the way that they do, and there are still so many things that they are not able to act upon, that they are not able to get responses from, because we've been working with them through learning cycles, strategically trying to adjust everything so that it fits, having a multidisciplinary team there in line to support them, and we still needed 15 years to be where we are now.
Mm-hmm. Just in a very short follow-up on that, we also have received a question from a researcher in Ghana expressing that in her view, the communities where people with a higher education backgrounds are able to better demand services. Any thoughts or views from your side how less endowed communities who are receiving poor healthcare services can be empowered to demand improvement in services from governments, and immediately acknowledging what you have just responded in terms of time, and that it takes time to progress and to have that demand for services.
I think that this education level thing is really a proxy for privileges. So what are the privileges that these people that have a higher education attainment have? They're probably more urban. They probably belong to the dominant ethnic group. They probably speak the dominant language. They probably come from a home where there were also other adults that are highly educated. And so all of these things translate into them feeling the privilege that they have and knowing that they can demand for things. I remember when we first started working with the defenders in this mode in CEGSS, it must have been 2006 or 2007. And it was before my PhD, so I know it's around that time. And when we would ask the people what they wanted from health services, what they would do to not be abused or mistreated, and they said, we can't do anything because this is a gift. These are free services. So just the understanding that they weren't citizens, that they weren't entitled to their rights, is something that happens in very lowly educated, very excluded, very marginalized communities, where if you see, a counterpart that's urban, that's educated, that's traveled, that person knows what the rights are and demands them. So it's not that education is the key to it. It's like, what is the proxy for it? And then how is that represented in that population, and what is then missing in the population that's being excluded?
Thank you very much, Ana Lorena. Ultimately, the aim in social accountability is citizen participation along with a responsiveness from the state side. However, health systems are deeply challenged and fragmented with few opportunities for appreciative and cooperative learning. Described as the burning platforms, the organizational cultures we operate in are severely challenged by human resource crises, corruption, lack of resources, poor governance. Compounding these issues operationally, we are characterized by top-down programming, compliance cultures, centrally defined targets and outputs, and also limited authority for local planning and management. In this context, question directed towards Dani, what are the key challenges as well as opportunities with regards to connecting with decision makers in order to activate public participation inclusive of responsiveness from the state side?
Thanks, Maria. So the challenges varies. The challenges in connecting to service providers varies. We have the local service providers and the upper level service providers. So I'll say it has been a lot of challenge in connecting to the upper levels service providers, such as the district, the province, or even the national, because these are people who are far from the communities, so they cannot really relate to what is happening on the ground. Another thing is they're always focusing on other responsibilities. So claiming that now we currently have commitment on this, or sometimes we are very far. So making those commitment has been connection has been a challenge. However, looking at the service providers on the ground, I will say it has been it has created a lot of opportunities for us as researchers, because through the work that has been done by the MRC Agincourt over the years, the unit has managed to build strong partnerships. So it has always been easier or achievable to connect with the local service providers, such as the clinic operational managers and all that. Another thing with the COVID-19 pandemic, I'll say it's a challenge. Again, it's an opportunity, so it's vice versa. With the upper level service providers, we have seen like a change in terms of how we connect to them, because now most of them are available because they don't have to travel long distance to connect with us. So using the virtual connection has enabled us to connect very well with them. And I'll say for the local one, COVID has become a challenge because these are rural service providers who do not have much knowledge on usage of technologies. So you would not expect let's say an Induna, a traditional authority member, to have access to a laptop or internet to make connections. So it varies with the setup. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Demi. And as we've also reflected following the presentations, is the opportunity in these case studies to also learn from these experiences and to build on that learning, which is very valuable. In order for citizen voice to address social and structural inequalities, processes require sufficient and sustained representation of marginalized population groups. As we've also addressed in the discussion with Anna Lorena, it feels intuitively obvious that this cycle of social inequalities should be interrupted, should be broken, in order to have access to quality healthcare services, and ultimately that the disproportionate
I think we lost Maria, unfortunately. Sophie, could you help us out with the remainder of the panel discussion?
Yeah, sure. So I think the question here was really aimed probably at you, Lucia, which is really about what practical steps can be taken to translate normative support into concrete actions that can meaningfully and beneficially create and maintain spaces to engage those living on the margins, to raise their voice, realise rights to and claims to health. Are you happy to take that one?
Thanks, Sophie. Hopefully Maria comes back to us. It's a really important question about how these very well-intentioned concepts can become realities. So for me, these practical steps are about blending, as I said, that inward-looking gaze, that is building community voice, building those core capabilities, with the outward gaze, to use Jenny Pope's terms. And by the outward gaze, meaningfully, simultaneously navigating those systems, opportunities and challenges. That idea, as I said, that it's not just communities that need to change. And we've tried to do that through thinking very carefully about representation and managing those power differentials, as Denny said, and as Denny leads our field team, engaging with people who are living lives of multi-dimensional hardship. A meaningful engagement and dialogue there is difficult with individuals who are often really angry and disruptive. And managing that, as Denny said, takes deep concern and commitment to understand these situations and constructively connect these voices and these realities to the authorities, and to do so in a sustained way. We also think about ensuring representation of voices typically excluded, and we continually check and recheck and have focused engagement to attempt to connect with people whose voices are typically excluded. And again, going back to Denny's remarks, doing that, the Agincourt DSS has been around for 25 years in this rural community. That gives us a certain level of credibility with and connection to rural communities, and enables us to reach out in that self-reflective, self-critical way. We also try to sort of, I think as my slide said, balance institutional memory with expanding our participant base. So over time, our community stakeholders sort of transition to community mentors who own the process with us. And we found that to be an effective model as we branch out, and now we're connecting with community health workers. So all these things are about building those collective capabilities. And the spaces and the processes are just as important, both as Fernando and Denny described. These are frameworks that evolve, that need to adapt to unpredictable context with regular exchange and interaction and feedback to hopefully institutionalize that trust and mutual understanding.
Thank you, Lucia. And just to also touch on that, and a question we've received from a research fellow working in the Brazilian context was specifically how vulnerable patients or citizens with, again, same question, lower education levels, and then often diminished sense of agency can be enabled to co-develop our system research. And I think in that the design of the participatory approach that you have taken, and we have taken in the VAPAR program, it is actually particularly looking for the most marginalized and including them so that their voices are heard. So that very much a focus of not a quantitative number selection process, but a qualitative one where we really try and find the relevant role players and actors in the community who typically would not have a voice. Thank you very much, Lucia. My next question would be directed at Sophie. As a former government official, I can say that researchers often fail to align to local context or to really engage and maintain a relationship with health policy and system stakeholders. While global research, health research in particular, is known for extractive and sometimes decontextualized practices, disenfranchising countries from their own data. Considering the diverse spectrum of stakeholders, the learning health system approach is really promising with regards to institutionalizing evidence and learning and improving care and outcomes, and for improving accountability of researchers also in the local context. As we've documented in South Africa, we are aware of limited decision space, that implying authority, accountability, capacity at local level for evidence-informed decision-making. In addition, research initiatives prioritize grants and applications sometimes over authentic engagement in relationship with authorities and community stakeholders. In this scenario, could you please share your view on how the learning health system approach can support a sustainable shift towards enabling state-society synergies? For example, with communities, with departments adjacent to health, and supporting and facilitating an accountable research process that is not only for the sake of research outputs, but for real change.
Yeah, okay, thank you. A very challenging question. I'm going to slightly sidestep some of that because I know we're also short of time, but really just to say that, so re-emphasize my point, which was that learning health systems are not about research per se. So they're often conflated because it sounds like the same sort of concept, but they are really about these organic processes whereby experience is accumulated, reflected on, shared and augmented. So researchers are part of the process, but they're actually only quite a small part. So most learning is coming from the participants in the system, and that includes the users, it includes communities, it includes health staff, managers, decision makers, as I said, at all levels really. And within that overall ecosystem, I think it is really important that we look at the incentives for kind of close to policy, solution-oriented work for the research community. And that's a challenge which I think is recognized. And that you allude to. And again, maybe echoing a bit what Anna Lorena was saying about the community side, one of the challenges for the kind of close to policy institutions that support researchers to do this more applied and hopefully relevant work is the issue of stable funding. So stable funding is one of the aspects that's really important so that you're not always just chasing papers, chasing latest research and sort of responding in some ways to the wrong incentives. But also at the individual level, it's important to link promotion for researchers who do social engagement and achieve impact, because that hasn't always been the case. And some systems are trying to, and in the UK we have this very notorious REF system, but within that we look at social impacts and we have to document them, and that's then built into some of the funding for the institutions. So I'm not saying that's necessarily the right way to do it, but we do have to start valuing and rewarding that kind of work. And I guess more crucial is creating the spaces in health systems to engage, as we said, in experiential learning. Some of the ways, just a couple of examples I think came up from the case studies on how we can do that. Some of it is often just simple things like, does the system have budgets for regular peer-to-peer meetings? Is that, because as we've recognized in VAPAR, very often there is no point of meeting for people to exchange, problem solve, either horizontally, peer-to-peer, or indeed vertically. Equally, are we rewarding the teams that actually innovate? So within the system, what are the incentives? Often the incentive is to kind of keep your head down and do as little as possible. That is obviously not going to create a learning health system environment. We need to look at really supporting and rewarding people who take action. Sometimes that involves risks, but if it's risks that are structured towards social gain, and are part of a sort of thoughtful team interaction, then there should be recognition, support, and rewards for that. So that's just a couple of examples.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And I think that slightly provocative question also just highlights the complex context within which we are functioning. Overall, as a last question, and I'm going to ask just one or two of our panelists to respond, because I don't think we can step away from the current context in terms of COVID-19. And Fernando particularly pointed this out, and it also transpired in some of the other presentations where this pandemic has changed much. On the one hand side, we've seen global pandemic responses with a top-down and sometimes technocratic or even a militaristic response aligned to a medicalized view of health. In other words, not really recognizing the social and behavior understandings of health and illness. On the other hand side, we've also seen new ways of thinking, multi-sectoral approaches emerging absolutely spontaneously, working with and independent of the state. Either way, this pandemic brought us in sharp focus that recognition of the need for new forms of real-time policy learning and understanding and responding to rapidly changing situations on the ground, cooperatively responding to these situations of complexity and uncertainty. So again, any one or two of our panelists that would reflect very briefly on the potential for this new scenario in the context of COVID-19 when it comes to accountability processes and policy dialogue to reorient this relationship between state and society. Dr. Dombroso.
Thanks, Maria. Just to say very briefly, I think we're running slightly over time, but yeah, I think I tried to deal with this a bit in my slides. It feels like something of a crossroads and a reflection of all those familiar tensions. Things can really go either way, either more concentration of power or more sharing of it. And as I said to begin with, perhaps that's why sessions like this are useful, crucial at this time to share learning. If we're about building alliances and keep working in fragmented ways, there's a deep irony there. And I'm so grateful to connect with others, the Guatemalan team in this instance, to think about the parallels between what we're doing so we can practice what we preach.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for that reflection. And thank you, as you've also alluded, we are slightly short on time, so I'm going to just move on to concluding remarks from my side. Social accountability and cooperative learning through a participatory process offer valuable insight into how social participation in health planning and policy making can be driven and achieved, not only by governments and state structures, but with additional support and guidance in the form of the newly launched WHO Handbook on Social Participation for Universal Healthcare, but also from the ground up by individuals, communities, social structures, and indeed also researchers. So some key insights from my side: we need to advance social accountability in the interest of the most marginalized individuals and groups. And if these spaces do not exist or we are not invited into them with current structures, it can be created and it can be claimed. The second insight: policy and planning requires information on the lived experiences of individuals and communities. And this should not be overlooked as a source of information or even a source of evidence and solution to challenges. In order for social accountability and participatory processes to bring about change, it needs to connect with authorities through dialogue, through shared or shifted power balance, and by building relationship as trust, as we have pointed out. Opportunities to embed these participatory and cooperative learning and action into existing processes could ultimately improve care and outcomes through progression of state-society synergies. And collaborative research processes contribute to this learning and potentially also support and facilitate engagement and participation between communities and authorities. So from my side, a very big thank you to our presenters, our panel members, for sharing your experience, your thoughts and insight, and for sharing the incredible, wonderful work that is being done on the ground, and also echoing Lucia's appreciation that we are able to share from two different contexts and find the common learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.